Good morning, guys. It is almost 11 o'clock Central Standard Time, September 7th, and I've got something super special for you guys I put together. I had a guide trip yesterday on Lake Belton with a good buddy of mine. His name's Aaron. And I asked him what he thought would be the most productive information to share with my audience. What are the things and the types of videos that I could make to be a really helpful resource for my visitors. And so this is kind of what I came up with. I've designed this lure selection guide here. With the help of my wife, I just kind of went through and said, what can I do to make a very streamlined approach for someone who's possibly new to fishing, or even someone who's a little bit more advanced and could utilize it for, making selections as far as their lures are concerned, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what I came up with, just to kind of make it, easy to follow. If you'll notice at the top right corner here, I have a legend for calm and sunny with the yellow fill color, and windy and cloudy with the blue. And so basically, those are two major determinants for whether or not I use a moving bait or more of a slow type bait. It just all depends on if the fish are spread out or if they're condensed. So typically on a windy or cloudy day, they're going to be spread out kind of in a more of a roaming posture versus during a calm sunny day, they're kind of sucking more to cover and their strike window is going to condense slightly. So that being said, this is going to be made available to anyone who messages me and wants to learn more about it, and maybe it's I could send it in a PDF format. You can print it out, you can laminate it, and this is something that you can carry with you during your fishing trip to reference. If you have any questions, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to really go through everything. I'm going to kind of go through a few different things here. It may turn into more than I anticipated, but basically, just to kind of guide you through this and make it easy to understand. It already is pretty straightforward, but you look here, I've got four different parameters for cover. So I've got wood, rocks, weeds, and docks. Those are pretty much the four types of cover that I encounter here in Central Texas. They're very straightforward, pretty simple. And of course, I've got on the top, on my top area here, I have spring, summer, fall, and winter. And under that, I have something called average depth. Now, there's a lot of variation in depth depending on what end of the lake that you're on, what time of the year it is, of course, what the watercolor is, what region you are in the United States. But this is specific to the Central Texas region, these canyon type impoundments. And it's pretty much geared towards, that clear to mid color water. Nothing super dirty, nothing like that. But these are just guidelines as far as depth. It's not like this is the absolute, this is, you got to be in 0 to 10, you got to be in 10 to 30, 20 to 30, nothing like that. So just guidelines. But now that we got that out of the way, seasonally, I put underneath that a guideline for what type of forage you want to be kind of trying to match. I'm big on match the hatch and understanding seasonality, how it affects movements of fish, and what kind of fish are spawning, what's been hatched already and swimming around in the water. So if you look at spring, for example, my primary goal is to mimic a crawfish or a bluegill, and the reasoning behind that is during the spring, pre-spawn, they feed heavily on crawfish, and I don't know if it's a developmental benefit that they get from ingesting crawfish. That's my best guess, just because of the the nutritional content that they derive from a crawfish. I think it helps them somehow during their egg laying process. All I know is that early pre-spawn they're feeding heavily on crawfish, and that's pretty much across the board here in this region. Um, of course, bluegill. Early on in bluegill, or early on in the season, bluegill are, kind of harassing the nests when these fish are trying to set up their beds. And a lot of times they're trying to get the bluegill out of their bed, and it's a good tactic to try to mimic a bluegill. So those two are kind of hand in hand during the springtime. Um, Summertime, you have post spawn. You also want to mimic the bluegill because post spawn you have the bluegill spawning. So once the bass is spawned, the smaller fish, will spawn, being bluegill and different panfish, etc., etc. So I want to mimic a bluegill. That's super important because once the bass are done spawning, they're gonna eat bluegill that are they're exposed and they're vulnerable during their spawn since they're focused on what they're doing on their nest, etc. So that's what I have there. Shad, of course, really the heart of summer, I would say, is focused on me trying to be a shad in my presentation. Most of the time, I'm trying to be a threadfin shad or a big gizzard, occasionally with like a big swim bait or a glide bait or something like that. Fall pretty much is all about shad. My focus is following shad into the backs of creeks. They like to hang around a lot of floating docks, things like that, to where they have cover and they can defend themselves. It's basically they swim around in big balls so that they can escape predators, and it's kind of a confusion type thing that they employ. When big groups of fish come in, they school together and they roam around like clouds. And so I follow those clouds around the lake. I look for the surface of the water to look kind of boiled, kind of like if you're boiling water on the stove. And a lot of times that's just bait fish swimming on the surface around in the backs of creeks. I look for birds. That's another important thing. I'm just kind of reading my environment to find out where these shad are pinned up, and a lot of it is determined by prevailing wind, things like that. So I'm really wanting to be a shad in fall. In winter, you have you have, especially up north, North Texas, the places where it gets colder, the shad plays a role because the shad starts dying off once the water temperature gets to a certain point. Not so much here, really south. We don't really get that cold, but mainly up north, when it gets super cold and you have these freezes, these shads start to die. And so, that would be the time to be throwing a jerk bait, to be throwing different baits that represent a shad. And not only that, but they're still moving around a little bit. They may be not as shallow as they were in the fall. They may be roaming around more in deeper schools, related more to the creek channels because that's how fish navigate. It's their highway system. So I would try to be a shad, but also in the winter I would also be trying to be a crawfish, and that's kind of um, you know coming back to the early pre-spawn. From that winter early pre-spawn period, I want to be a crawfish because it's a preparation for the spawn, and it's a good time to be trying to mimic that. So I'm not going to go through all the techniques here. I may go through a couple techniques that are, for the beginner fisherman, something that they might not be super familiar with as far as throwing. But, it's pretty straightforward. You just look at wood and you say, hey, I'm fishing near trees and it's windy or cloudy, and it's springtime. Okay, great. You can throw a square bill crankbait, rattle trap, or swim jig. These are just my suggestions. There are so many different types of baits out there, and a lot of them aren't on here. But this is my go-to equipment and what I like to throw and what works for me, what I'm confident in. So, just to point out a couple things, um, that are kind of unique. You'll see on my on my guide here, um, different things that I want to point out. So flutter spoon, a flutter spoon is a big deal. A lot of times offshore during summer, you'll have wind come through and it'll be sunny, but it will also be windy. And what that kind of results in is that sun is going to help these fish to suspend. They're going to kind of suspend, and you could throw out a spoon. And if it's windy, they're kind of in a feeding disposition, and they're willing to kind of break out of their condensed strike window that they get whenever it's hot and they suspend. So that spoon coming to past their face, whether it's offshore on big rocks or wood or whatever, a lot of times that's a really deadly technique. And the flutter spoon, you can actually, I'll pull up a flutter spoon here so you can see kind of what I would suggest. Let's see. So something like this. This is the Lake Fork flutter spoon. This is the Lake Fork Nichols Lake Fork flutter spoon here, Dick's Sporting Goods. Let's take a peek here. They have a couple different colors. This is a highly reflective type of finish, so that's really good in the sunlight because it glimmers and it's more of a flash, and so it's a trigger. It's a triggering mechanism for bass that may be somewhat inactive. It's just like a flash that they react on. This is a really popular color right here, this blue shad, just basically blue and chrome. But so that's something that I like to throw. That's something that most beginners don't normally start out with. It would be like something like a flutter spoon. So that's kind of neat. Um, Excuse me for that. You look at something like on the opposite end of the spectrum, you look at something like a blade bait. Okay, so I mentioned a blade bait here for wintertime in the weeds. Okay, so grass, etc. A blade bait is a really neat bait. Why it's so special is because, so if you type in cotton cordell, it's called the gay blade, and it's a really neat bait here. It's basically a cross between a spoon and a rattle trap, and so it's really super special because most bait fish, when it gets cold, they have a tight movement that they're not real aggressive and active. It's more of a excuse me for that. I just got someone who left me a voicemail there, but it's more of a tight wobble that you see with bait fish in the wintertime. Everything kind of, their metabolism slows down. So that gay blade, you can jig it vertically like this, and it's staying really tight, really tight. And it's a really deadly tool that a lot of beginners don't know about, and even a lot of advanced anglers don't really employ normally during their fishing day. So those two are really special. Also, the hair jig, that is a killer. Um, Hair jig for bass, that's something a lot of people don't throw, you know. Let's see. Here's a hair jig right here. This is Northland fishing tackle. Um, I like a white hair jig, kind of like, here's this Cumberland Pro Prayer jig. Um, Very basic, but what it does is when you throw it out there, the texture of the hair jig is such that it kind of poofs a little bit and kind of poofs and compresses, and it kind of just glides slowly, and it's a really enticing fall. And then when you pop it, it just darts, and then it kind of drifts and falls, and it's a very just tantalizing type of action. It's kind of hard to explain unless you see it in person, but that's one of the best things you can do whenever fish are suspended is throw out that hair jig. Um, but but yeah, I mean, there's really everything on here. Umbrella rig. swim baits, skipping jigs, Senkos, a lot of different things. I just sort of wanted to point out those couple exceptions that you may not normally come across on the everyday. So, I'm gonna make this available. If this is something that interests you, just shoot me a holler, and you can send me your email, and I will send you. I'll send you a copy of this, or you could just kind of reference it through my videos. But hope that really helps. I know that if I had something made available to me like this when I was, starting out, or even kind of midway through where I've been at so far, as my experience, it'd be very helpful. You could just, like I said, you could laminate it, you can keep it on your boat, and it's something you can just reference quickly. So appreciate you guys tuning in, and as always, I'm going to continue to try to put out quality content regularly, to help everyone out, and make fishing more fun and make it easier. I mean, that's really, at the end of the day, we want to put fish in the boat, and we want to have success out there on the water. I will say, don't get discouraged. There's certain times of the year that they're just not really biting, and that's okay. So appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in.